the Editor Open Access Journal event features two very special guests who are Dean for the Sciences. Joshua Brumberg will introduce momentarily. But before I turn it over to him, I want to share with everyone, or I'm going to share in the link, share in the chat, I'm sorry, a link to our new Science Communications Academy page. And you can go here to get tips on how to talk about your science to the general public, and also to sign up for our events, our future events. So now I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Josh.
Thanks, Shawn, and thanks to everyone attending. It's really great that not only do we do science, but we learn about how best to publish science and to communicate the science. So hopefully we'll be seeing you at these science communication events throughout the academic year. And as Shawn says, just check out the website for all the information. Today, I'm delighted to introduce our two panelists. First, Dr. Elisa De Ranieri, who is the editor-in-chief of Nature Communications, which, if you don't know, is a multidisciplinary open access journal. And we're going to be talking a lot what that means to be open access. She received her PhD in physics from the University of Cambridge in the United Kingdom. And then following completion of her doctorate, did some research with Hitachi before joining Nature Group, where she worked in a variety of different publications, traditional print publications, and now open access Nature Communications, where she's been editor-in-chief since 2019. Also with us is Professor Michael Eisen. He is the editor-in-chief of eLife, which is a nonprofit open source journal, and we'll talk about the difference in terms of the funding models, which really focuses on the life sciences. He's also, and I said to this before, most impressively, an investigator in the Howard Hughes Medical Institute, and his laboratory is based at the University of California, Berkeley, where he studies the genetics, genomics, and development in the cell biology department there. He's been really at the forefront of open access publishing, having done a postdoc with Patrick Brown and Nobel Prize winner Harold Varmus, who you might remember from our 5th anniversary event about this time last year, who and Harold Varmus co-founded the Public Library of Science, which I think was the first of the nonprofit open access journals. And so welcome to both Elisa and Mike. And just to let everyone know, is the first half, I'm going to ask some questions, and then hopefully you will come prepared, or some of this will stimulate your questions. Put them into the chat, and then in the latter half of the hour, we'll ask you to unmute so you can ask your question directly from Elisa and Michael. So what I thought about first is, when someone says open access publishing, what does that mean to you? I'll start with you first, Michael.
Sorry, I had to unmute myself. So open access was something that came about in the early days of the internet, when publishing first went online, which is quite a long time ago, 25 years ago. Journals at the time kind of adopted their business model that they had used for print, which was to charge subscriptions for access to their content. And we felt that that was not taking good advantage of the internet. And so, we and others at the time tried to come up with a economic model and a publishing model for science journals that would allow anybody with an internet connection to get access to the content without paying, but at the same time would recognize that publishing costs money and that there are costs involved in handling peer review and turning manuscripts into documents. And so the kind of way we felt it was most sensible at the time to do that was to treat the cost of publishing as a service that you pay for. Authors are really whoever's funding their research would pay some cost that's, now a few $1,000s, or depending on the journal. And that after paying those costs, which allow the journal to recover their expenses for handling publishing, then the content would be freely available. So the kind of broadly speaking idea behind open access is it's a way of handling publishing that where the costs are paid up front, and as a consequence of paying the costs up front, the contents are made freely available to everybody with an internet connection, as opposed to a subscription model where only people who either work at an institution that pays subscriptions can get access to it, or people pay on a la carte basis for the article. So that's sort of what open access is and sort of why it is.
Elisa, do you want to add anything to that description from your perspective?
Yes, let me just, okay, I hope you can hear me.
Yep.
Yeah, I think, Mike has explained very succinctly what open access means. I would say, just to throw a few considerations out there already from the start, the considerations that we should discuss as part of the open access switch as a business model is, who is paying for the publication. And as Mike said, basically authors are paying, but that means authors that get published in the journal. And to some extent in very selective journals such as mine and I think Mike's too, and others, it means that basically the cost of that entire running of the journal is borne by a subset of authors, because all the authors that are rejected either at the desk stage or after peer review basically do not contribute to the financial sustainability of the journal. So that's I'm not saying that's right or wrong, I'm just saying that's one consideration to keep in mind when we discuss business models around publications. And I would say the other thing that I want to throw out there from now is I'm inspired by Mike's background of CC BY, is you can be open access in many different ways, and that means what kind of license are you publishing your content with, and CC BY it's the best license just because it allows the widest reuse of the content, and I think most journals adopt that, but there can be others that, the fact that you can access the article for free doesn't necessarily mean you can reuse its content as you wish, right? So that's licensing is another important aspect for me of open access, and I think that's just about all I wanted to say at this stage.
I'll just add, Josh, just quick point, which is, we started, I think it's important to note, I think this is true for lots of people in open access, we start from a principle here, and the principle is that the product of science should be completely freely available to anybody who wants to use it. And that means read it, but also use the content. And so I think this issue about, making sure that we think about things that people don't spend a lot of time thinking about, like licenses on copyright. It's really critical, because if you get that wrong, you end up with content that can't be reused, that can't be redistributed, and things like that. And so I think it's important, there's an economic aspect to it, but it's important to note that this all arose from a goal, and the goal was to make sure that the products of science would be freely available to everybody in the world. And then it's backtracking from that you end up with an economic model, as opposed to the economic model is a way of achieving that, not a goal in and of itself.
So Elisa, you mentioned licensing, and we have a lot of graduate students here that might not know about licensing and the different types of licensing, and I know Mike has the common one behind him. Can you comment a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, for what I can, so I was saying there's a number of different types of licenses that you can publish your content with, and we have adopted CC BY 4.0, which I suspect is the same one that eLife adopts, where this is the license that allows for maximum dissemination and reuse of the material, and it's what most funders prefer. So any user can share and remix the contributions within the publication, as long as they provide full attribution of credit for whoever generated that content. And just to be clear, so that means that in this type of license, the copyright remains with the authors, which is a very, very important point. And there are other sort of less permissive licenses that might allow you to perhaps reuse the content, but not for commercial purposes, or perhaps to reuse the content, but without the ability to remix that content. So there's you know, kind of a spectrum of options there. And over time, at Nature Communications, we have moved from a more restrictive license to this one, CC BY 4.0, which is, I think, Mike might correct me if I'm wrong, but I think is the most permissive in terms of reuse of the content. So again, I think it's, as Mike was saying, you know, licenses is not something that we talk about very often. It's not a very sexy topic, but, you know, it's important that people know the difference when they select a journal in which to publish, that they look at what license their content is published by.
And I think people probably don't know this, you know, if you haven't experienced it, and even most of the people who've experienced it know it. You know, you own the copyright when you write a scientific paper or you write a paper. And most journals require that you know, most traditional journals require that you sign over your copyright to them, or that you give them some, you know, exclusive rights to use the content for their, you know, their purposes. And, you know, again, because open access started from the idea that we wanted to empower people to use the content, we wanted to not just keep the copyright with authors, but we wanted authors to say, we give you permission in advance to use this material, you can reproduce it, you can reuse it. And so the CC licenses as a whole are designed to, they're an expression by you as an author to potential users about what kind of things you allow them to do without having to ask you for permission. So when you use a CC BY license, what you say is, you can use my content, you can republish it, you can include it in databases, you can do whatever you want to, provided that you acknowledge that I wrote it. So you can't take my content and claim you wrote it. You have to, the BY part of CC BY means you have to acknowledge who the work is by. But other than that, you have sort of blanket permission to reuse the content in lots of ways possible. And the idea there is to avoid you having to go back to the authors and say, is it okay if I do this? Is it okay if I do that? Because when you're doing that for large sets of literature, it becomes completely impossible to do. So I think it's really important that people you know about these things, because otherwise I think people's instincts are to hold on to as many rights as they possibly can, just because it seems like the safe course of action. But in fact, in terms of enabling all sorts of things that people do with content in science, it's super important to specify in advance what kind of things you're okay with, so that other people can take advantage of it.
Now, you know, for folks who might not have published in an open access journal, is the process kind of from submission to publication the same versus a traditional print journal, or kind of modified?
Yeah, I don't know if you want me. I can say for us, it's, you know, basically you wouldn't, for the most part, you wouldn't know that you're publishing in an open access journal, because, you know, the process and the way in which you pay for it are really not, they're not linked. You can do all sorts of things the same or different with a journal, and then charge people to access the content at the end, or charge authors to a fee at the beginning. I mean, I think, you know, in general, open access journals tend to be a little bit more adventurous with how they use peer review, and because they're kind of thinking in a more kind of forward-thinking way. But there's nothing, you know, for the most part, I think you wouldn't notice the difference between a submission to Nature and a submission to eLife, for example. So.
Yeah, I would just add to that the only difference that's specific to perhaps to our journal, but it might apply to others, so I think it's worth you knowing about it, is that, let's say if you submit to Nature Communications, because it's open access, and if you don't have the means to pay for the APC fee, then you should tell us basically at submission. There's a team. It's not an editorial team; it's a financial team. You know, they're my colleagues. I don't even know who they are, to be honest, because it's such a big company. But basically, basically you tell us at submission that you want to request a waiver, as opposed to tell us at the end of the process when your paper has been accepted, because that, of course, it complicates things, you know, if you leave it too late. So just so you know, if you do plan to submit to our journals, for example, and you want to request an APC waiver, do this at submission as opposed to later in the process. That's the only difference. As Mike was saying, we process papers from the peer review point of view exactly the same as any other Nature journals, for example, which operate under the subscription model.
Yeah, and I'd say most open access journals, you know, was one of the problems of the open access model is that it can create a barrier to publishing instead of a barrier to accessing the content. And so at eLife, we have basically a blanket waiver policy if you can't afford to pay. I mean, I do think we're starting to think in the community about other models for funding journals that are not transactional, where you neither pay to publish nor do you pay for accessing it, and kind of recognizing the fact that at the end of the day, the money's coming from the same pot, which is the funders and institutions who are supporting science. And so I think, you know, look forward 5 years from now, I think you'll see that funding of publishing infrastructure and publishing kind of actions it's gonna start to look more like a centralized kind of system, because these transactional models always have a problem. It always creates a barrier for somebody who, you know, to participate, and we want to get rid of those as much as possible.
One thing that always has struck me, and I actually personally like from open access journals, I think they were the first to identify who the peer reviewers were. I don't know if that's the fact, but that's been my impression. And do you think that's affected the quality of the review or the willingness to be critical with the reviews in any way?
Yeah, Lisa, I don't know if you want to handle that first. Yeah,
I can go first. Yeah. Okay, this is a very big topic, and personally, this is me speaking. It might not be the position of the journal as a whole, but personally, I think naming reviewers doesn't do as much good for science than publishing their peer review reports. So, you know, I think I'm all up for publishing reports with or without names, but, you know, in the kind of moving towards a more transparent peer review process, one of the things that we do, and you know, we do this, right? I'm not saying we don't. So we do publish reviewer names when the reviewers agree to that. Whether, you know, this is publishing reviewer names, it's a knife with two edges, right? Because on one hand, you want to be transparent, you want to tell the world who the reviewers were, but there's a lot of considerations around this that, for example, you know, how is this going to affect minorities? Do you put people on the spot? Do you bias them by, you know, let's say you're reviewing, you're an early career researcher reviewing the paper of a very important person, you know, that you can publish your name. If that paper gets published and you get somehow associated with it, are you going to be more lenient towards that paper because you want your name published with it? So there's all sorts of considerations, ethical considerations and behavioral considerations that need to be taken into account. So I think so the uptake for us of publishing reviewer names is only 32% compared to about 70% of authors that agree to us publishing the reviewer reports. And I think, you know, all I'm saying is my preferred method would be that we always publish the review reports, and on top of that, you can publish the names whether you like it or not. But just publishing the reviewer names comes with this set of potential consequences that we need to deal with. I don't know, Mike, if that's your impression.
I share that. I'm almost completely in agreement. I think that you know, we also do essentially the same thing at eLife. We share names of our editors and reviewers when they consent, and I do worry a lot about both the possible problems with that. One of which is, we definitely hear from a lot of people, even senior scientists, that they're reluctant to criticize the works of their colleagues if they have to put their name on it. And you can argue that we should be comfortable with it, and like in an ideal world that wouldn't be the case. But in reality, people are concerned about that. And on the flip side, there's certainly people are happy to sign their name when they say really nice things about a paper from a senior scientist. And so I think we are at the moment trying to wrestle with this question about whether whether full transparency with the identity of reviewers and editors is good, or whether full anonymity is actually the preferred model, where the journal acts as the source of credibility for the process, not the individuals involved. Now, like Lisa, I completely agree. I think the more important thing to focus on is the transparency of the decisions and the transparency of the process. And so, for every paper that we accept, and we're moving much more to a model where this is true for every paper we review, we publish the review reports. I think that the critical thing to do is to publish what the reviewers say and what the logic is for their decisions, as opposed to who they are. And I think it's, I think we will see, and are already increasingly seeing, a move towards open peer review, where articles get published as preprints first. They're there and available for everybody, and then journals come in and they review them, and they post the reviews, and they stimulate a discussion that happens in public, where everybody can see whether they agree with the reviewers' decisions, whether they've learned anything from them, or whether they think that the reviewers are incorrect in what they're saying. And I think that is, to me, is a more important step than just identifying actually who was behind it.
So you raised an important issue there, Mike, about preprint repository. So I think that started more in the physical sciences. So I'll start with Elisa with ArchiveX, and now we have BioRx. How has these type of preprint servers impacted open access publishing or access to the data?
That's a very good question. First of all, I always get a little bit upset when I see that once bioRxiv started, everybody's now talking about preprints, and the physicists had that for 20 years, right? No one cared, but we had it first.
30 years. You've had it for 30 years.
Yeah. True. So, no, jokes apart. I think, as Mike was saying, I think we're going more towards a situation where a paper starts life as a preprint, and we follow it through the process. Not even, the publication of that paper is not even the end point, because we are going to see more and more of this concept of the living paper, basically a piece of work that gets updated and becomes something else, and it evolves over time, maybe with the same DOI or a version of that DOI. So, this is becoming more in the digital age. This is now possible. We're not constrained by print anymore, so that things like that are possible. And the way this has changed open access, I think it's in my view, that the preprint movement has kind of given even more momentum to the open access movement. And we've seen this with the with the COVID crisis, where the reliance on preprints on COVID has been really great, because of course we wanted to share that information as soon as possible to combat this pandemic. So I think it's adding momentum to the open access movement, and in terms of the sharing of data, I guess we're going to discuss this in more details, but with open access is just a business model, if you like. It was born by the noble principles that Michael described, but it's just one aspect of what we can more broadly call open research or open science. And that means not just making the results of the work accessible to everybody, but also sharing the data. So open data is another big thing. And this again is picking up momentum as we speak. And there are other things besides preprints which go in that direction, in terms of opening up the work that's been done before, before we used to do that in the traditional models. And I'm talking here about register reports. That's a specific article type that is suitable for certain types of disciplines, not for others. But basically, in this article type, the authors will allow reviewers to review their methodology before a study is even conducted. So before you even start collecting data, reviewers will tell you, is your methodology sound? Are you going in the right path, before you spend maybe a year collecting data that turns out to be useless, right? So I think for me, this is again part of the same movement of kind of opening up the research process earlier in time, which can do with preprints, with register reports, by opening up your data once it's published. So that's how I see it. I don't know if Mike has more to add.
Yeah, I would say, I think even more broadly, I mean, I like to think about all these questions in terms of what would science publishing be like if we'd invented the internet before the printing press? And so many of these aspects of publishing are still constrained by our history of having done things in a print publication. And preprints are a great example of breaking out of that, right? Of kind of recognizing that once you have the internet, an author publishing something, they don't need an infrastructure. They don't need someone with a printing press. They just need a button on their computer that says publish. And I think that the future of publishing, where we're moving to, and where we should have moved to 30 years ago, when it's just taken us like a really long time to kind of capitalize on the internet in the right ways, is a world where publishing is something authors do. An author makes a decision to share their work. They post it on a preprint server. I mean, look, physics has been doing this since 1991, and it's still a perfectly happy, viable field. This doesn't destroy the credibility of institutions. It gets information out there more quickly. So to have a world where authors share their work as soon as they think it's ready to be shared, but that carries only the weight of the authors. It's not peer reviewed. It hasn't been scrutinized. And that process of scrutiny takes place after the authors have shared their work. It takes place publicly, and where the authors then can respond to that in the way that Elisa says, which is to their document gets better. Maybe they add more data. Now they have a stronger findings. Maybe they discover something that the peer reviewers pointed out, and now they've changed the way they think about their own work. And the documents evolve. The whole world of having a static document is only because we had to print it, and it had to be fixed in printed form. And that is, it's just no longer true in the internet. It's just like saying, Wikipedia was going to stay fixed as how it was in 2005, and we were never going to update it, right? That's obviously not an effective way of collecting and sharing information. And I think, the great struggle in publishing is, how do we get to those, to achieve those kind of goals while still living in this world where jobs and careers and grants and things like that are still doled out in large part based on this old publishing model that, where you have to get citations and publish fixed papers. And I mean, really, it's 25 years of trying to manage this transition from, print publishing to internet publishing. And I think, it took biology 20 years longer than it should have to come around to seeing the advantages of preprints. But now that that's happened in biomedicine, which for better or for worse is the biggest economic part of the industry. I mean, it publishes the most papers, it has the most money. That maybe this system is really finally going to shift to the one that Lisa's describing, where our documents are living documents, where commentary happens not in this hidden way in smoke-filled rooms, but rather in public, where people can participate and take advantage of it, and where it's not just one journal that decides whether a work is important or not. It's the whole community, and there's a lot of things we could do a lot better in publishing than we currently are.
So you mentioned, things going back to the print, and there's a lot of, pressure in terms of tenure and promotion and jobs on the certain, one-name journals. Do you feel, and this I guess would be to Mike, because you inhabit both sides of this kind of divide, do you think there is a bias when applying for a job if you have published a lot in open access journals, or does that affect tenure and promotion decisions in any way, or is that something that's slowly changing?
I wish I could say that it was something that people were rewarded for. I think it can be. I think I have benefited in my career by having made a whole point about the fact that my lab only publishes in open access journals. It becomes kind of a feature. But I'd say for the most part, unfortunately, people are still, even in communities that are well aware of the problems in publishing, you still see, as one candidate who has 2 Nature papers is viewed as being the better candidate, even if their science is no better. And I think that it's something we fight against constantly. Everybody in the whole world admits that this is a problem, that, you know, everybody admits that it's a problem that we judge science based on where it's published as opposed to what it actually accomplishes. But you know, we haven't come up with a better way, basically. You know, it's still true that it's hard for a search committee to read the work of all 600 or 700 candidates that come in front of them. It's hard not just because you don't have time, but because, you know, you don't always know, right? You're not always an expert enough in a topic to know whether something is important or impactful. So we rely on the community to help us interpret and find value in works. And right now, the only way we have for communicating those judgments is by what journal things end up in. You know, it's one of my big goals at eLife is to change that, is to come up with a better way of articulating what it means. You know, when you review a paper, what does it mean that I think this is important? How do I say I think this is you know, incredibly well done and impactful, right? But right now we're stuck in this language of journal titles. And so long as that's the only way that we communicate our judgments, we're gonna, you know, it's understandable that that's the currency that is used in employment and grants and things like that. So for me, actually, this is the biggest challenge we face right now in publishing. I would say open access is important, but preprints kind of solve the access problem. If everybody posts a preprint and they're freely available, then what journals do with their content becomes less significant. And I think the bigger challenge is, you know, the way I think about it is journals themselves shouldn't exist, right? The journal is itself an anachronism of print, of the, you know, having to bind a bunch of related papers together into a single title and mail it around. We should start rethinking of ourselves, not as publishers, but as reviewers and curators of the literature. And I think that part and parcel of that shift is rethinking what the output of our process is. It shouldn't just be putting a stamp on a paper and saying this is or isn't an eLife paper. It should be, you know, here's what we think about it. Here's why we think it's important. Here's why we think it's well done. Here's where we think there are challenges and questions, and figuring out a way to do that in a succinct enough manner that it could be used in hiring and promotion and grants is we don't have a solution for that yet. And I think until we come up with something that is as convenient and compact, or at least similarly convenient and compact as a journal title for conveying our judgment, we're gonna always compete against it, because it's, for all its flaws, it's an easily digestible piece of information. And I think it is, to me, this is the biggest challenge in publishing today, is coming up with an alternative for journal title that works to convey information, because I think that once we do that, we can liberate the review and process from its antiquated origins.
One of the things.
If I can.
Oh, Lisa, go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to add that I think there is one tangible benefit of publishing open access, that it's been documented, and you'll forgive me, I don't remember the actual figure because here it's almost dinner time and I already had a glass of wine by now. So, but you know, it is true that open access papers, unsurprisingly, are more cited than their counterparts, just because more people can access them. It's not, you know, it's not very surprising, but it means that by publishing open access, as you know, as unsurprisingly as it is, you reach more people can read your work and perhaps reuse it, so that there is that tangible aspect. And I would like to say that I fully agree with Mike that the system needs to be reformed. The system of research evaluation, it's you know, long overdue for a reformation, and I don't know what the answer is. It's such a complex question that involves all, you know, researchers, funders, publishers, the entire ecosystem. Basically, it's a very difficult question to solve. And I just want to make a comment on what Mike said in terms of whether there's even a need to have a journal. And I do agree with you to some extent, Mike, on a personal level. You know, I'm not saying that is the journal position, but I do agree with you that I think where journals could still make an impact is not so much into, as you were saying, putting the stamp or this is a valuable paper or it isn't, but it's more about kind of facilitating the discourse within that particular community, right? So try to bring that community together, curate the content so that there is trends that are emerging are showcased. So I think that kind of editorial curation of a discipline, there's still a space for journals for that. I'm not saying that, for example, a journal such as Nature Communications is best placed to do that, because we are, a massive multidisciplinary journal, and we are struggling ourselves to see how can we address our individual community niches in a way that makes sense to the researchers. So I don't have an answer, but I'm just thinking there is still space for a specific type of journal, but I fully agree that the publishing ecosystem shouldn't determine the research evaluation kind of criteria.
Right. I mean, and I'll just add that I think that I completely agree that the challenge for entities, whatever journals evolve into, is to serve, to curate and link up communities and serve as kind of a hub. But in a world where we don't have, papers don't go to just one journal, now say it's a scientific society that represents like I'm a member of the Genetic Society. The Genetic Society, they wouldn't be in a position of only publishing and curating the papers that happen to get submitted to their journal, but rather every paper in genetics. That is, that if you get rid of journals as publishers and start thinking of them as curators and community hubs and things like that, it gets rid of some of the inefficiencies and absurdities of the current system.
So one of the dangerous underbellies of open access journals is predatory journals, which I think somehow it affects the impact or the perception of when you're dealing with it. So if a student or a postdoc, they want to publish in an open access journal, obviously eLife and Nature Communications are real, but there are thousands of journals. Some are what we'd say kosher, and some not less so. How would you tell to a prospective person thinking about publishing in open access, evaluating the correct forum for which they should publish?
Yeah, I think the easy answer is you should look at what they published. I mean, I think that you're going to be judged by the papers are judged by the neighbors they keep, basically. And I think there are. My opinion, there's enough reputable, high-profile open access journals. Like if you put together the scientific societies and the big publishers like PLOS and eLife and Nature and others that have not just single journals but suites of journals, you cover a large fraction of the community. A lot of the predatory open access journals are poorly known commercial it's hard to figure out who the publisher is. They're not a name you've ever heard of. There are efforts to kind of catalog these. There's a directory of open access journals, and there's this society of open access journals, OASPA, that has standards for how journals should operate. And it's not that I think we should always avoid new players in these fields, but one of the pathologies of the business model is you can basically just make money without doing any work by taking in papers and not actually peer reviewing them, but saying you do and then posting them online. And that's what the predatory journals do. They're kind of claiming they're offering a service that they don't actually provide, and I think it's generally easy to avoid them if it's like you stick to some relatively big brands, or if you're looking at new brands, you just kind of try to figure out who the people behind them are. And if you can't figure that out, if you can't figure out who's behind a journal and what the entity is and whether or not they make sense, then that's probably a bad sign.
Yeah, and I would point out Mason Brown, who's our science librarian, who's joining here today. Remind us to always reach out to your librarians who have a good idea.
Yeah, they know better than anybody. The librarians are the greatest repository of knowledge about journals in the universe. They know more about journals than any publisher does. So.
And Mason does, I think we do once a semester a thing about open access predatory journals. So I don't think he's done it yet. So look at that on the library website for all the.
I will point out it is a problem in that there are a lot of them, but they publish relatively few papers. So if you look at the bulk of open access papers, very few of them are in predatory journals. It's a phenomenon that needs to be fought and avoided, but it is not. As a consumer of the literature, you can still be pretty confident that most of the papers you're going to read have gone through proper processes. And I'll also not to be too much of a defender of open access here, but there are also predatory subscription journals, and so the same problem exists and has existed for a long time. There's $10 billion a year goes into science publishing. Anytime you put that kind of money on the table, there are going to be people trying to bleed a little bit of that money off for their own purposes without actually providing services to the community. So it's been a problem for a long time. It just has a slightly, it has a new set of players involved.
Yeah. So Mason is putting the links in if anyone wants to get the further information about that in the chat. So Elisa, you work for a company that straddles both sides of this divide. There's obviously a lot of print journals, and they also have a whole suite of open access journals. Does that impact at all how the company works, or does each of the publications kind of have to stand on its own in terms of bringing in the costs that are required?
Sorry, what did you say at the end?
So obviously you have to cover your costs. That's what Mike,
sure.
And Nature is at its heart Nature Springer is at its heart a for-profit organization. Does that impact things, for instance, versus eLife, which I see more as a nonprofit type operation?
Yeah. No, but I mean, for sure, we are a commercial entity, and the commercial entities are supposed to make money at the end of the process. And I have to say, I work obviously in the editorial department. I don't really have that much of an insight in the commercial side of the business. And that's a good thing, because we have to maintain our independence from what the commercial people would like us to do, right? So I can only partly answer your question, but in the day-to-day, in terms of how the journals are run, it doesn't really make an impact on any individual journal, the fact that within the same portfolio there are different business models operating. So we just assess papers like all the sister journals assess papers in a similar way. And at the end of the day, when the publishers have to reconcile financial sheets, it's more of their problem, it's not really my problem. So in that sense, I thankfully am kind of relatively protected from the business discussion, so to speak. And of course, I suspect, eLife and they will have their own issues in terms of the funding. They have the backing of big funders. From the business perspective, I can't really comment beyond saying that the fact that we have a mix of subscription titles and open access titles doesn't really affect the day-to-day of how the journal operates.
Yeah, I would second that. I think that editors' job and reviewers' job is to handle papers and read them and think about them. And by and large, editors don't think about the business side of journals. I'll also, point out that it is a little bit of a misconception that nonprofit publishers are free of commercial concerns, right? We're a business as much as Nature is. Just the only difference is, we don't return profits to stakeholders. And I would say that, one of my big surprises in publishing over the years has been that actually the nonprofit sector of publishing is in some ways more conservative than the for-profit sector. I mean, Nature, for all I object to some of their practices, has actually been pretty progressive in thinking about how to move publishing forward quite often. Whereas a lot of scientific societies, who are all nonprofits, they make they don't give their money to stakeholders, but they use the profits of their journal to fund the society's operations. And because they don't have the possibility of getting big investments and kind of trading risks against future profits in the same way that an entity like Nature does, it's actually made a lot of the nonprofit part of science publishing a lot more conservative. Now, eLife, we're in a much different position, again, because we're kind of an instantiation of a different model, which is a model where the funders of science actually directly subsidize publishing instead of doing it through subscriptions or APCs. So, everybody in publishing is dependent on money from funders. It's just we get it in a different way. And that has freed us up, I think, to try and do new things. And it's really our mission is to do new things in publishing. Our primary mission is not to run a successful money-making business. It's to have a positive impact on science through publishing. And but we also are a business. We have to have a bottom line. We have to make money. At the it's a complicated. It's always a complicated thing. But people. I think people tend to often mistake nonprofits for being charities or something. They're not. They're businesses. They just have a different ownership structure and a different remit for what they do with their operating surpluses.
So my final question before we open it up to the audience is, we have a lot of graduate students here or postdocs, and maybe they want to sit in the seats that you guys now inhabit. So, about making that decision? What kind of skills do you need to be successful? And if Mike, you can also comment about balancing research versus your editorial efforts. I don't know who wants to go first.
Yeah, I guess I'll just say, there are two different sort of ways of two different broadly speaking ways that people go into publishing. And I think Elisa and I represent kind of those two different things nicely. I mean, I think, whatever it is, I balance my job and all the editors at eLife, the ones who handle papers are all academics who are balancing their time as practicing academics against their time of working as editors for the journal. And that has pluses and minuses. These are people who are sort of on the front lines of a particular field. They are, I can't maintain contact with every field that eLife publishes. So, you rely on having academics who can handle, who we rely on having academics who are, at the front lines of a field. But, you're then balancing that against the fact that they have other jobs. Usually they're running labs and teaching and doing other things. So editorial tasks are kind of fit into their days. Whereas for Elisa and professional editors, this is their job, and they can spend much more of their day doing editorial tasks than someone who works as an offshoot of their jobs. But I would say that the actual things you need in order to be a good editor were the same in either case. I mean, it's not every scientist and not every person who's been trained as a scientist makes a good editor. It takes someone with some perspective, who wants to read, I would say wants to see the good in science, who wants to look at papers and find out what's interesting and help bring it out and help share it with the community. I think the best, I've worked with academic editors and professional editors, and the best ones are people who have a broad interest, if not experience, that they want to read papers in fields that they've never seen before. They want to try to understand it and use the scientific literature as a good thing. So, how people get into careers like that, I think Lisa's probably a better person to think, talk about how to get into it as a career. But I can certainly say as an academic, it's there's certainly lots of opportunities. Journals, academic editors are, valued by the journals. They're doing, we pay our academic editors a little bit, but it's far less than they're worth. And, we take advantage of the fact that reviewing and editing is considered part of your kind of job writ large. And I think as an academic, it's easier to get into because I think, you're kind of in some sense volunteering for the job. I think Elisa can speak to what it's like to get into it as a professional.
Yeah, I would say in terms of skills, in addition to whatever Mike has already said, I would say from the point of view of being able to do the day-to-day of the job, especially for a professional editor, making a relatively high number of decisions, I think you need to have, pretty decisive mind, as in, decision making, it's your bread and butter, but also more importantly, the ability to kind of assess quickly what is the most important information in a piece of work and how that relates to the broader literature, and trying to make that judgment call of whether you think that's important and advanced enough for your journal or not. And then I think what Michael was saying, I relate to completely, and I would phrase it as, you need to be able, you need to be someone that wants to champion your areas. So you need to be someone that loves the science that you perhaps used to do as a researcher, and now you're a professional editor, but you really want to help your former community to be represented in the pages of your journal, whatever that journal is. So you need to have that kind of passion for science, and you need to be obviously a good communicator, because you are kind of in a way helping the researchers to get their work out there, perhaps also to the general public via press releases and stuff like that. So you need basically to be a good science communicator with a passion for science and with analytical skills that allow you to stay on top of the work. And in terms of how you become a professional editor, first of all, I should say, because I see some comments in the chat about this, that we do, we're happy to give like a small webinar where we discuss how do you get to these careers, and in more details what skills we normally look for when we hire. So that, if you're interested, more than happy to provide a webinar either from myself or one of my team. But yeah, in short, typically when somebody decides to move on from their academic career for a number of reasons, vacancies are available in many journals all the time. You just wait for the one that is relevant to your background, and then there's a selection process that tests the attitude towards the skills that I've described, and then you become part of the team, and then there are opportunities for career progression within the team once you're in. I should say that it's a very cool job if you don't want to do science at the bench, or for some reason you can't do that anymore. It's a very cool job because you remain in touch with kind of the front edge of science. When in normal times you travel a lot to conferences and stuff, and now obviously no one's going anywhere, but that's a very cool aspect of the job as well. So it's a career that I would definitely recommend to people that are thinking of perhaps moving on from academia.
Thanks. Emily Armbruster had a question. I don't know if she's still with us. If she could unmute and ask her question.
Sure, yeah, I'm here. So I have two questions about something we've discussed a little earlier about these living documents, and how papers are going to be these living documents even before and after sort of the publishing step right now. And it really reminded me of how poster sessions almost go, where you're presenting research before you put it into a paper, or even you're getting your field's input on your current work. And I'm wondering, and this reminds me a bit of even poster sessions that are online now with COVID, and I'm wondering if there's any reformatting of papers to be expected for this sort of transition that like you would expect. And then also with this sort of transition into living documents, there's all these pitfalls that usually go along with editing documents within a group with like collaborators and whatnot. And I'm wondering about what type of platform do you see happening for these living documents to be hosted on?
Yeah, there's a lot there. So I can take a few of those things, which I think are interesting. I mean, another legacy of print that we still suffer with is that there's no data, like that documents are basically words and static figures, right? And that is, they're like snapshots of some stuff that's created in the lab. But if I want to interact with the data, or I want to look at it in a different way, there's been very little progress to sort of using the general infrastructure we have with computers and other digital tools to make the documents more interactive, for example. And I think that the way, like I do a lot of data science work, and like, I have big, long notebooks of code and data that I analyze all the time, where if I want to tweak something or I want to look at the data in a different way, it's trivial to go back and make something. And it essentially, can propagate through the document very quickly. And there's just this idea of that things are much more a living entity that include data, tools for interacting with the data, whatever wrapper of explanation that the people who conducted it want to add, either in terms of details about how it was done or what they think it means. The opportunity is very obvious, but all these questions you ask are super important. So then, like, what does that mean? Do you have to become a coder to make a living document that is like a constant thing that you're doing? Is this just a way for, is this like further alienate most scientists from the process of publishing because now they don't have the tools necessary to create it? Is this a, is it a multi-author? Like, does the lab have a single living document that is like its current output? Is there a whole community? I think these are things we haven't really wrestled with, in part because we just don't have any examples of it, right? Like the fact that there is no precedent really in the field for documents that are anything but a static representation of science, I think has prevented people from even starting to think about what the challenges are and to create tools for doing it. I should say at eLife, we've just started to publish documents that are basically code, that have the code in them, where for very data sciencey kind of publications, we want these to be, executable documents where what you see isn't a static document. It's something that's created from the data and the code underlying it, with the ultimate goal to allow you kind of to tweak it and create a new version of the document and to play around with the figures in your own way. And I think our hope is that once people start to see the kind of things you might be able to do if you used a different paradigm for publishing, then I'm going to write a document and turn it into a PDF. Then I think we'd be in a much better place. I often make a joke about this. I mean, right, the first scientific journals were created in the 17th century, and like most people think that the first scientific journal is the Royal Society, Proceedings of the Royal Society. The French disagree, of course; they have their own first journal. But if you imagine the scientists who are members of the Royal Society, Francis Bacon and others, coming forward to today's era, they would find basically everything about modern life to be completely and totally alienating, except scientific journals, which look, more or less identical, with the real addition just color, right? Color and different fonts compared to what they looked like 350 years ago. And I think that is a kind of a condemnation of our inability to have taken advantage of technology in front of us to try to change the way that we communicate results and data. I mean, just the whole idea of flattening a complex work of science into a single static printed document we should find that revolting. It's like so alien to what we should be doing in the way that we think about science. And I remain kind of amazed at how little progress we've made in doing all these things. But the problems you point out are part of the reason, and people are kind of scared of the idea of what does it mean for a document to be constantly changing? How can I cite it? How can I use it? If a scientist's ideas about what their own work means changes, how do I interact with that? Like, and what does it mean to interact with that? And it's definitely easier to interact with a world in which you have single fixed point things that are published and stay that way. And that if the field evolves, it evolves in some other document. But that too has, that's limiting in a way that I think is ultimately bad for science.
Thanks. All right. Sejal, I'm sure I'm pronouncing that incorrectly.
It's Sejal. Hi, I'm a postdoc in the Neuroscience Initiative, and thank you for this wonderful discussion. So I'm an early career researcher. I engage in lots of these open access science platforms. And, one thing that I really appreciate, and you mentioned that, I think there's also a lot changing in publishing. And I think my question is about as an editor, how do you see the review process itself changing? So for example, there are a lot of open review platforms available. Do you see in the next few years, the open science publishing would sort of move in the direction where you don't go around looking for reviewers, but it's all just open, and then that's how journals will decide? Do you see that happening anytime soon?
Maybe I can start this one
Sure.
off with my personal views. I think that's definitely an interesting development, and I think that in the ideal world, that would be the best way to do things, right? You put your work out there, and anyone can comment, perhaps after they've kind of validated themselves to have the right expertise, or there would have to be a system of validation for expertise at least. I think where this idealistic model fails a bit is just people don't have time, right? So how do you ensure that at least a few experts do look at the paper, do provide feedback, and that they are the right experts to do so? So that's what I think. That's one of the reasons why we haven't got rid of the traditional journal format yet, because the journal format provides a solution to the problem that we are struggling to find otherwise. This is not to say that people are not trying. F1000 is the most prominent example that springs to mind in terms of kind of pre-publication review, if you like, in the sense that you put your work out there and then people can comment on it, and then it's published. So I think it's a very interesting development that there are these initiatives bubbling up, but I think the main issue is resourcing it in terms of finding reviewers. How do you ensure a stream of competent reviewers that take a look at all of those papers if they're not solicited by a journal editor?
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I think we're trying to wrestle with exactly this question right now. So we're moving at eLife to a model where we're going to review preprints. That's what we do. Papers that are published as preprints, and we're going to review them publicly and openly. One thing that the challenge is, we want. I mean, I think it's a big waste of time in the community that we have so many people who read papers and have interesting things about them, but they don't have a good mechanism for sharing their reviews in a way that actually people are going to care about. So what we're going to, what we're, kind of thinking about doing is making it a public fact that a paper is under review at eLife. And so not only do we solicit reviews from people in our own way, but we invite anybody who wants to also submit their comments on the paper as well, that would inform the reviewer's decision, so that there's a mechanism for people to know not just that they can comment on them, but that they get taken into consideration when people are making some kind of decisions about the paper. I also think, in my ideal world, we all live on kind of a common, we live in a common space, like preprint servers or whatever it looks like in the future. And there's some mechanism by which we have better tools to put the right papers in front of you as a scientist. So instead of having to do searches, there's already kind of primitive AIs that do this, but that presumably will get better, where like you have a stream of papers that are coming in front of you. And as part of your job as a scientist, you say, well, I'm going to, I have to read a bunch of these papers, but I'm also going to start reviewing them. And instead of a world right now, like the hardest thing for journals to do right now is to get reviewers, right? Is to find the right and competent reviewers for a given paper and to follow up with them and chase them and get them to do them on time. I would much rather see a world where you select the papers that you're reviewing, and we have a mechanism to make sure that like there aren't 10,000 reviews of one paper and 0 reviews of 10,000 papers, right? That there's some incentive to review papers that haven't been reviewed and so forth. But where it becomes much more integrated into your part of your day-to-day life as a scientist, that rather than a journal has to ask you to review a paper and then it sits on your desk for 10 days or 14 days or whatever until you happen to be on an airplane or whatever. That doesn't happen anymore, but you happen to have the free time to review the paper because they're nagging you. But instead, you say, oh, look, I've got 3 hours this afternoon while my experiment's running. I'm going to go review a paper I'm going to find the paper that is most interesting, most pertinent, most valuable for me to review right now because it's in my area of expertise and it's important and nobody's reviewed it. And then you review it. And then the role of a journal is to kind of aggregate those reviews and look at who reviewed them and what their opinions are and maybe find if there's missing information. That is to be much more engaged with the public and the community of scientists in the process. And so exactly how that happens and what the mechanisms are, I don't know. There's a lot of practical challenges. And I think the biggest one is how to make sure that it doesn't just become a popularity contest where, the papers that are getting the most attention on Twitter get all these reviews and then everything else gets kind of ignored. And that we definitely have to have some mechanisms to make sure that this is an equitable process where it's not, where people are reviewing the stuff that's valuable. But I think that's some version of that is the future, where review is really a collaboration between the community and entities like journals that are acting to curate and make some kind of, put those comments together into some kind of useful whole, but not to be completely and totally in charge of the process to the exclusion of everybody else who might have valuable information to participate.
All right. Well, our hour has basically gone by in a snap. I really want to thank Elisa and Michael and for sharing their insights and their experiences and educating us about open access. And I would be remiss if I didn't thank Shawn Rhea from communications for really setting this up. We recorded today's webinar. We're going to put it on the Science Communications website. And Elisa, I think we're going to take you up on the offer and sometime set up another webinar more about if you wanted to go into this field, what to do. But thanks very much, Mike and Elisa. I hope you have a good rest of your day and a great weekend.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you for organizing this. These are always great. And I'll just say, if people have other questions they want to fire at me by email or something, I'm easy to find on the internets.
Wonderful.
Find it, email Shawn or I, and we can get you Michael's email.
Yeah. Thanks a lot.
Thanks. Have a good weekend.
Thanks
You
all.
too.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Thanks.